Remember to sign up for my newsletter at historyasithappens.com. Every Friday, you'll receive an email from the Washington Times giving you a look inside the stories we talk about on the podcast. Sign up at historyasithappens.com. History as It Happens, April 6, 2023. The long 1960s.
I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people.
The Great Society rests on abundance and liberty for all. It demands an end to poverty and racial injustice.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept, the nomination of my party for another term.
It is a crisis of confidence. It is a crisis that strikes at the very heart and soul and spirit of our nation.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
The era of big government is over.
Ordinary and middle-class Americans build America. My dad used to have an expression. He said, Joe, a job is about a lot more than a paycheck. It's about your dignity. It's about respect. It's being able to look your kid in the eye and say everything's going to be okay.
The simplest reason why Congress will not pass a sweeping agenda desired by the left is they don't have the votes. Neither party has dominated American politics as, say, Democrats once did during the New Deal era. Instead, we've been stuck for decades in a partisan stalemate, says historian Michael Kazin, an obstacle to change that may only be overcome if one party attains a dominant position once more. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Let us be clear about the nature of Starbucks' vicious anti-union efforts.
Let me say under oath, these are allegations and Starbucks has not broken the law.
Should we make it much harder for employers to bully workers, to keep them for long hours at meetings, to convince them not to vote for the union? Fines, much heavier fines on employers than there are now for engaging in what are called unfair labor practices, firing workers trying to organize a union, for example, which is expressly prohibited by the Wagner Act. It's much harder to organize a union than it should be.
There's a debate happening on the left. It's about the best way to achieve progress, to enact a legislative agenda that expands the welfare state, guarantees health insurance, abortion rights, raises taxes on the wealthy, you name it. Some liberals, maybe more centrist liberals, prefer incrementalism, others more radical measures aimed at dismantling the existing capitalist system, or at the very least, redefining the relationship between citizen and government once more. That was one of the accomplishments of the New Deal, to establish a modicum of security and predictability in life in a capitalist society. But here's the problem with any comparisons to that period of frenzied legislating. It was brought on by a massive crisis, the collapse of the economy, so that by the time FDR took the oath of office, the unemployment rate was around 25%. Because women mostly did not work in those days, that meant 1 in 4 households was without a breadwinner.
This nation is asking for action, and action now. Our greatest primary task is to put people to work.
We don't face a crisis like that today, although some might say our problems are bad enough and they require major reforms and new programs like universal paid family leave. But there's no way such legislation would ever make it to the president's desk with Congress split down the middle. It would require a large Democratic majority. In a New York Times op-ed, historian Michael Kazin writes, "Not since Joe Biden first claimed his desk in the Senate half a century ago have either Republicans or Democrats governed the nation through more than 1 or 2 election cycles. The score in the past dozen presidential contests is a flat-out tie, 6-6. Control of one or both houses of Congress has ping-ponged back and forth since the 1980s as well." He says the longest stretch of partisan parity in U.S. history has trapped us in a political stalemate with little hope of breaking out. As a result, problems that have long plagued the nation, economic inequality, undocumented immigration, climate change, the undermining of democratic values, persist. A true realignment could shake us from the festering gridlock, but what would it take for one party to dominate American politics again? And that is Michael Kazin, the distinguished historian of the American left at Georgetown University. Well, one possible way forward for Democrats is to restore an old voting base, private sector unions. Easier said than done. Efforts to organize, to vote to join a union, to negotiate a collective bargaining agreement at companies like Starbucks and Amazon have been very difficult. And Senator Bernie Sanders says the reason is, in the case of Starbucks, it broke the law to stifle its employees' unionizing campaigns. Here is Sanders attacking former Starbucks CEO Howard Schultz at a recent hearing.
Are you aware, Mr. Schultz, that an administrative law judge ordered you to record and distribute a video of yourself reading a notice to Starbucks employees about their rights under the National Labor Relations Act, how Starbucks violated those rights, and to assure that Starbucks will not infringe upon those rights in the future, and that this notice must be posted in all Starbucks stores and shared digitally to all of Starbucks employees? Are you prepared to read that notice?
No, I am not, because Starbucks Coffee Company did not break the law.
White working-class voters may be the largest constituency in the country, and Democrats once enjoyed significant favor with them. But Republicans have made inroads for years for a lot of different reasons. Because of this partisan stalemate, Michael Kazin argues Americans are living in a long 1960s. Progressives and conservatives, he writes, still battle over some of the big issues that roiled the nation half a century ago. Affirmative action, the right to abortion, rights for gay men and lesbians, environmental protection, and the content of education, with little lasting movement in either direction. Well, I'll add, if President Biden had 70 Democrats in the Senate like FDR, we might be having a different conversation. His latest book is What It Took to Win, A History of the Democratic Party, now out in paperback, and it is a terrific read. Michael Kazin, welcome back.
Great to be back.
Are congratulations in order for your book being published in paperback now? Is that how it goes? Or?
Sure. It came out in paperback at the end of February.
You know, I've never published a book, so I don't know how this works. That's your 7th book. I'm 7 behind you. And your essay in the New York Times touches on that issue. What will it take for, in this case, Democrats to win? But if you spend any time online, Professor Kazin, you are aware of the debate, if you want to call it that, between centrist or pragmatic liberals who see incrementalism within the system as the best way toward progress, rather than more radical, if you will, liberals and leftists who want to tear down the system. We're in late-stage capitalism. We need a new way, sweeping changes to the economic and social order. Given what you wrote in the Times, historically speaking, I think this debate misses what you get at, and that is, unless you have a huge majority in both houses of Congress and control the White House, you're not going to get major fundamental change. Is that your point?
Yeah, it certainly is. And look, what you want depends on what your politics are, of course. And I'm a social democrat. That is, I would like us to have a larger welfare state, a larger labor movement, much more equality within a fundamentally market capitalist society. How you get there depends on how much power you have. And of course, in our system, we have 3 branches of government, and if you don't control at least the presidency and Congress, and hopefully a bunch of major states as well, and have close to a majority of the Supreme Court, you're going to have a very difficult time passing major pieces of legislation, reform legislation, and making sure that they can be enforced, and making sure that the courts will not get in their way. And it's been very rare in our history, actually, that any party has had that kind of majority for very long. And that's the reason I wrote the piece, arguing that usually it takes some kind of crisis for that dominance to take place, or some kind of crisis for the dominance to end as well. And we haven't had that many crises on that order in American history.
You argue that we've been trapped in a partisan or political stalemate where one party controls things for a short period of time and then power swings back the other way. And we're, 50-50 now, especially in the Senate. And we've been that way for quite a while now.
I would argue for the last 50 years, really, at least since Richard Nixon's second administration, which, of course, was cut short by Watergate, and he resigned. Since then, we've had 12 presidential elections, and each party has won 6. And control of Congress has gone back and forth. Sometimes one party controls the Senate, the other party the House. It's been very rare for one party to control the White House and Congress for more than 4 years in a row. since the 1970s.
Some would say that the system is working as it was set up to work, that you're not supposed to have sweeping changes all the time, that it's built in, right? There are checks built in on rapid and dramatic change.
Well, I'm not sure the framers of the Constitution really hoped that there would not be any kind of major change ever, that we'd be in a stalemate like this with, and of course, the framers of the Constitution hated parties. We keep forgetting that. They didn't want parties. Madison, famous Federalist number 10, called factions. Of course, we can't guess exactly what they would have wanted. It's a silly task to even try to do that, I think. But the idea that serious problems in the society, and there are many, continue to fester as both parties try to get a little more advantage of the other party and usually fail to for very long, that's not something any sane designer of a republic would actually want. And whatever you think of the founding fathers, they were pretty sane.
Well, I naively believed that after January 6, we had reached one of those hinge points in the American experience. Of course, how do you know when you're living through one of those periods, right? Until maybe years later where you can look back and say, oh, yeah, that was a watershed moment. What happened after January 6 was not the same as the Great Depression, right, which ushered in an era of major reforms, the New Deal. But I believed after January 6, naively, Republicans would now distance themselves from Donald Trump, and there would be a brief period, maybe even longer than a brief period, of bipartisanship to work on what is popular legislation designed to ameliorate the problems of economic inequality in our country that had been exposed or made worse by the pandemic. It didn't prove to be one of those rare moments. So you may chastise me there for being naive.
Well, I mean, the problem is, in a structural sense, as I was saying before, if the two parties are fairly close in popular support and the elections have been very, very close, then to cross the aisle in a serious way, to really be bipartisan, is very rarely a winner for politicians from either party. The only time that's a winner is a situation like Joe Manchin in West Virginia, where he needs to win lots of votes from people who voted for Donald Trump, or else he's not going to get reelected. But in both cases, as you know, you get primaried in strong blue districts, strong red districts, if you cross the aisle and work with the other party, or known as someone who wants to compromise with the other party. And that's why when you have one party that really is dominant, as the Democrats were in the 30s, 40s, most of the 50s, and most of the 60s, then you do have Republicans who crossed over. Remember, in 1964, Civil Rights Bill would never have passed if a lot of Republicans had not voted for it in the Senate and the House. And they didn't vote for it because they were wonderful people, though some were, certainly. They voted for it because they thought they were going to lose votes in the North from voters who had been Republican, who were now voting Democratic, including a lot of black voters, if they didn't vote for it. And we don't have that situation now, where one party feels it's in their interest, actually, to sound more like the other party.
So what were then the three periods of prolonged one-party dominance?
Okay, a little history lesson here. I'll make it short. First of all, you might say the period of Jacksonian democracy, which in our terms wasn't all that democratic. It was pretty democratic for white men anyway, at least a lot of them. This begins in the 1828 when Jackson wins election, and it ends sometime in the 1850s when the sexual crisis became so serious, the Democratic Party basically split. It did split in 1860, actually. There were two Democratic Party tickets. In the 1870s, we have another period of stalemate that sets in, and that lasts till the 1890s. Then there's the Great Depression, which was almost as great as the Great Depression we think about in the 30s. In the 1890s, the Democratic president's in power. Grover Cleveland, he doesn't win renomination, but the guy who does, William Jennings Bryan, is swamped by the Republican William McKinley. And then from the late 1890s until the Great Depression of the 1930s, the Republicans are very much the dominant party with, again, some exceptions. There are always exceptions here.
Sorry, well, Woodrow Wilson only wins in 1912 because of Bull Moose.
Because the Republicans split, exactly. And you could argue if the Democrats hadn't split in 1860, Lincoln might not have been president. Who knows? We might not have had a civil war. Again, a lot of what ifs. Well, then the crisis of the 1960s, in some ways, I think we're still in a way, pretty much ends what historians call the New Deal order. The New Deal doesn't exist anymore, but the order, the kind of assumptions about politics that Franklin Roosevelt and his supporters brought in to the country in the 1930s really continue to reign through the 1960s. But the Vietnam War, the racial crisis of the 60s, so-called law and order charges as crime goes up, all that helps to end the New Deal order. And it's really since then we have not had a dominant party. So the three periods are the Jacksonian democracy period, the Republican dominance in the late 1890s up to the Great Depression, and the Democratic dominance from the 30s until the early 1970s.
So the New Deal order. This is how Franklin Roosevelt, who was a brilliant politician, was able to get his legislation through Congress. The 74th Congress of the United States. So this is the midterm elections of 1934. That's typically where the incumbent party in the White House loses some seats.
Right.
The Democrats gain more seats in both houses. And by the end of that Congress, in the Senate, the Democrats had, as a percentage of the total vote, 75%. And in the House, 73%. And after the next election, 1936, so Roosevelt wins re-election, he has, again, somewhere in the area of 75%. Democrats control about 75% of the voting share in both houses of Congress. So there's your explanation. Biden has 50-50.
And of course, there's a different party than now. We have to acknowledge that the key group there, in some ways, could have swung to the right, were Southern Democrats, who were not going to endorse any legislation coming out of the White House or coming out of liberals in Congress that would have chipped away at the Jim Crow system in any serious way. That was one of the reasons why Roosevelt's administration was very progressive, left-wing in lots of ways, but not on race. They would have lost the votes of almost every Southern Democrat if they had, let's say, endorsed an anti-lynching bill or even gone farther and endorsed a civil rights bill, which didn't happen until the 1960s.
African Americans were excluded from some of the New Deal programs for that reason. Otherwise, he would have lost his program because the seniority in the Senate, right? He had these gray-haired old Southern senators who were the chairman of the key committees there. These people hailed from, well, the Jim Crow post-Reconstruction South.
But of course, at the same time, they did want relief programs. They did want federal programs for their constituents, for their white constituents. One of my favorite examples is there was a guy named Rankin who was a congressman from Mississippi, John Rankin, who used the N-word, used anti-Semitic slurs on the floor of Congress all the time. But he was also the chairman of the committee that began passing the TVA program, the Tennessee Valley Authority program, which brought electricity, public power, to a broad swath of the lower South. So he wanted a lot of big government when it would benefit his constituents who often didn't have electricity in their homes and in their farms, in their cities. But he was very much opposed to anything, as you said, that would have helped black constituents, even though the TVA did end up helping blacks as well, but of course it primarily helped white property owners.
And this is where African Americans begin voting for the Democratic Party because of FDR. So there was something in there for them despite some of these problems. The 74th Congress, before I move on here, I just want to mention some of the major pieces of legislation. What a record. The Social Security Act was passed during this time, the National Labor Relations Act, the Rural Electrification Act. It's amazing. So you're saying we're stuck in the long 1960s. What does that mean?
Well, in the sense that we're still arguing about a lot of issues that were really first raised in a serious way in the 60s. I mean, think of what's up from the Supreme Court this session, affirmative action based on race, for example, the content of education. There was a lot of battles in the 60s when I was in college in the late 1960s about how history should be taught. And we're still arguing about that today. The arguments conservatives make about critical race theory, for example, which really comes out of the scholarship of the 1960s and 1970s. Of course, we're arguing about the rights of gay and lesbian, especially of transgender people, which began to be an issue again in the 1960s, early 1970s. We're arguing about what you should do about crime. Police brutality was a big issue for the Black freedom movement in the 1960s. And it's the big issue of what we should do about the police today. Should they be reformed? Should they be using deadly force as much as they do, et cetera, et cetera. And also really the divide between progressive Democrats on one hand and conservative Republicans. Those two groups are still very much the activist core of each party. And arguably, there's nobody but conservative Republicans among Republicans anymore, and pretty much hardly any so-called centrist Democrats around anymore either. Joe Manchin, example, there's a few Congress people who are in swing districts like Jared Golden in the 1st District of Maine, Northern Maine, who have swing districts. But generally, the core of each party is still pretty much what it was in the 1960s. That is, very progressive Democrats, very conservative Republicans.
On the abortion issue, which some say might
I didn't mention abortion.
Yeah, pretty much all national Democrats are pro-choice. Pretty much all national Republicans are pro-life.
Well, the issue of abortion is interesting in terms of the stalemate, because ironically, perhaps, you probably had more Democrats at the time of Roe v. Wade who were opposed to abortion than you did Republicans. Republicans were overwhelmingly Protestant party at the time. The Right to Life movement had really been begun by Catholics, and most Catholics were Democrats at the time. So even though the abortion issue certainly is an issue which comes up in the 60s and early 70s, of course, and has whirled our politics since then, the partisan divide there is somewhat different than it was at the time of Roe v. Wade. Because, for example, George H.W. Bush was on record being pro-choice. In fact, I think he
population control.
Yeah, and contributed to Planned Parenthood, I think. And his father, who was a Senator Prescott Bush, his father, who was a senator from Connecticut, was very much a moderate Republican. Nelson Rockefeller, the former vice president, governor of New York, was pro-choice. So there was a real divide there, obviously. But the divide was more based on which kind of Christian you were, Catholic or Protestant, at the time than it was based on party. And, for example, the Southern Baptist Convention, the largest Protestant congregation today, was in favor of Roe v. Wade, because they didn't want the government intervening in religious affairs. They were Baptists, and Baptists were always opposed to strong government telling people who they should worship and how they should worship. So, of course, that changed by the late 70s, but in 1973, one of the strongest bastions of the pro-life movement today was actually pro-choice.
Yeah, the population control idea, which sounds kind of nefarious, but that was based on the notion that if poor people have too many kids, really, right? They won't be able to raise them properly, and then you get a whole host of societal ills. I mean, that was the thinking, right?
That was part of it. I mean, it was split because obviously there were a lot of feminists who were supportive of abortion rights because they thought, as now, that a woman should control her own body.
But as far as the population control idea goes.
Well, that's certainly true, yeah. There was I think he was a biologist named Paul Ehrlich who wrote a best-selling book called The Population Bomb sometime in the early 70s, I believe, where he did believe that, and of course, at the time, there was a fear that China would have 5 billion people, India continue to grow, and so forth. It's the idea that the resources of the world wouldn't be enough. So you'd have riots, you'd have terrible famine, and so forth. So far, that hasn't happened. Now, of course, our great fear is about climate change, which I think is probably more scientifically valid than the population bomb fears, but we'll have to see.
So you have argued in your New York Times op-ed that to break out of this festering gridlock, the long 1960s, you say we need a true realignment, could shake us out of this. When was the last major party realignment in U.S. history? Was it the post-civil rights realignment? Was it the Reagan Revolution?
It is time to reawaken this industrial giant, to get government back within its means, and to lighten our punitive tax burden. And these will be our first priorities, and on these principles there will be no compromise.
Yeah, it really was, again, the end of Democratic dominance, the end of the New Deal order, when unions began to decline and a lot of white working people began to oppose affirmative action. They thought that black people were getting ahead of the line, so to speak. And that's when you do have Richard Nixon, for example, winning a huge majority in 1972 against a pretty progressive Democrat, George McGovern. The union movement did not support the Democrat in that election. And so you begin to have a split between, you might say, the cultural left and the economic left. The economic left had been, for a long time, based in the labor movement. Labor movement begins to decline. A lot of white working class men, whether in unions or not, begin to think that Democrats are becoming the party of elitist liberals, university professors, students who are writing against the war, et cetera, et cetera. And that begins, I think, a move where now is pretty much advanced, where by large majorities of white working class men, that is men without a college education, vote Republican, much more than Democratic. That was not true at all in Roosevelt's time. It was just the reverse. If you were wealthier in Roosevelt's time and more educated, you voted for Republicans. That's a huge change. And that's true of more and more white working class women as well. So that's when the base constituencies of the parties began to change. Again, that has not, as I said before, produced a dominant majority for either party.
And the key here, again, Professor Kazin, is that in order to get some of the sweeping changes that some on the left, many on the left, want, you do need to have a large majority in both houses of Congress. Without it, you're not going to get those programs, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's pretty obvious by now, especially with the filibuster, as aggressively as it's used by Republicans now and would be by Democrats, too, if Republicans took back the Senate.
But the chances of anyone, either party, getting, say, 75 in the Senate, I mean, that's almost zero at this point. So how would Democrats get there? Is rebuilding the labor movement one way?
Democrats aren't going to rebuild the labor movement by themselves. The labor movement has to be rebuilt by working people. That's the only way it can happen. You can't do it from the top down. The Democrats can, if they could pass this bill called the PRO Act, which would make it easier to organize unions, that would certainly help. They have to do what politicians always have to do, which is to appeal to people whose vote they're not getting now. And that would be white working class people for Democrats. That would be suburban college educated women for Republicans. And how to do that is not an easy, I don't have a great answer for either party.
It's difficult, right?
If I were a consultant for either party, I'd say I'm not really sure. One argument that Democrats are clinging to, and maybe it'll be true, maybe not, is that as long as Donald Trump is the leader of the Republican Party, if he wins the nomination to run again a third time next year, if he is under indictment or certainly is convicted, that maybe that will make him look like a sort of a criminal version of Herbert Hoover, who certainly helped the Democrats back in the 30s. If they could keep running against Hoover, Democrats will try to keep running against Trump. And the abortion issue, too, obviously has worked for Democrats to a degree in the midterm last year as well. But that's nothing like the Great Depression that helped Democrats in the 30s, nothing like the Great Depression of the 1890s that helped Republicans. So I do think, and here I'm a little pessimistic, I'm afraid to say, I do think it's going to take probably another crisis of that order with a party in power which is perceived as being totally inept, immoral in their flailing attempts to solve the crisis, to lift the other party to something like a majority again. But right now, we're kind of stuck, with such fierce partisanship on both sides and not many people in the middle.
Well, I don't know if running against Trump is a good long-term strategy for Democrats. I don't know.
He's not going to be alive. He's not going to be alive, for another 20 years.
How does that help them with working-class whites who have defected from the party? We did an entire episode about a year ago about how Democrats lost blue-collar labor over the decade, so we don't need to return to that entire story here. But certainly Republicans, if they can get Trump out of the way and elect a sane and stable person, believe they have an opportunity to effect a sort of realignment by invoking Sanders-style, Bernie that is, economic populism while maintaining the right-wing culture war stuff.
If they actually do that, I'm not yet convinced that enough Republicans really believe in regulating corporations and helping labor unions revive. I mean, those are so deeply ingrained in the Democratic Party, New Deal onwards, as part of their Democrats' DNA. And Republican donors, corporate donors, are not in favor of strict regulations on corporate profits and certainly aren't in favor of making it easier to organize unions. So as much as people like Josh Hawley, senator from Missouri, might talk those ways and a lot of attacks on woke capital, that's more of a culture war appeal, I think, than a real appeal to the economic interests of working people. And look, culture matters. I don't think that it's possible, perhaps unfortunately, to appeal to people only on their economic interests, because people aren't just economic animals, They care about cultural values. They care about religious values, race, too, unfortunately. But at the same time, I do think Democrats and Republicans, too, if they want to be successful, do have to propose things that will help a large majority of people in this country who feel very insecure, even with unemployment as low as it is.
So I shared with you an article in the New York Times with the headline, Democratic Report explores blue-collar struggles. Our brand is pretty damaged. This report was done by Democratic consultants and pollsters. They went into the industrial or deindustrialized Midwest to find out why Democrats are still struggling there. I mean, do you agree with that premise before I get into some of the findings in this report?
I'm not a Democratic consultant, but but you can tell from the votes that certainly, look at Ohio, for example, which is mostly a white working class state. Democrats have lost there to Trump twice by 8 points each time in 2016 and 2020. And Sherrod Brown, Democratic senator there, who I'm a big fan of, actually, people should check out his work. He's the only Democrat elected statewide, I think, in maybe 10 years or 8 years at least. So, and he's running for re-election this year, and it's probably going to be a very, very tough race.
Well, the data, according to this report, found Democrats struggle with the perception that a democratic economic plan does not exist or doesn't help regular people's own working families. Democrats do have economic plans, but voters don't always know about them or aware of them. I mean, this is the old argument that Democrats are just bad at messaging, but I think there's more to it than that, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, the kind of things that Democrats can brag about are more indirect. That is infrastructure, for example, building things. Sometimes people know when there's infrastructure construction going on in their community that is something which Democrats have done. But no, usually they just say, oh, it's good. Government should do these things for us. They don't think of it as a partisan thing. One of the things Democrats, I think, tried to do was to they tried to pass universal pre-kindergarten, for example. They tried to have money sent to children during the pandemic. I tried to make that more permanent. These are sort of payments to families that can help them navigate economic bad times and have a certain amount of economic security. Healthcare as well is another issue there. Those are the kind of things I think that really would benefit Democrats. And of course, they do have to sell them to people. But infrastructure is great and it's necessary, of course, but it's something that people expect government to do. But if people, they don't have to worry about getting childcare when both parents have to go out to work, and Democrats could take credit for that, that probably would make a difference. But that's something, as you say, with Congress so closely divided, it's very difficult to pass those programs.
And those programs are fairly mild when you look across the spectrum. Democratic or social democratic politics in, say, Europe, right? I mean, those are standard programs in many countries. But in our country, they're labeled as socialist, when really people on the left say those ideas, while necessary, are only nibbling at the margins. They want a more frontal attack on capitalism. I want to return to that in a moment, but I want to bring back the New Deal for a moment and the Great Depression. That was such a cataclysmic shock to the system that it provided an opening for FDR and the New Dealers to redefine the relationship between citizens and their government, right? So you get Social Security, you get interventions into the private sector. Today, I shared with you an article by Steve Fraser in Catalyst, which is a journal of the left. He argues that sometime in the middle of last century, the left took its eyes off of the labor question and began focusing on economic inequality and other forms of inequality, and that was a mistake. Do you agree with him?
Well, yes and no. I should say Steve is a very good historian. He wrote a great biography of Sidney Hillman, one of the greatest labor leaders in American history. And he's my former editor, too, when he was at Basic Books. So Steve's a friend. But I think yes and no. On the one hand, yes, of course, labor ceased to be central to what Democrats are talking about. But the labor movement, too, was not organizing new workers the way they had been in the 30s and 1940s. Labor tried to organize in the South in the late 1940s, a thing called Operation Dixie, and failed very badly in extending their ranks to southern states. And so really what Democrats do, what parties do at the top, is depend a lot on what ordinary Americans are doing at the bottom and in the middle. Part of the problem was labor was not pushing the labor question itself in that sense. It's also true, though, that in the 1960s, the period when the Democratic dominance of politics begins to end, Democrats are focusing much more on race than they are on class. But again, you have a movement which is pushing them to do that, the Black Freedom Movement. And of course, the changes in our racial order were absolutely necessary and urgently necessary to make us a democracy in fact, as opposed to a democracy just in theory. So Fraser is right, I think, about that, but at least as you describe it, he doesn't really fill in the context enough, I think. Democrats are not just out there by themselves deciding, oh, what should we focus on today? They are, just as Republicans are, they are responding to what seems to be the electoral wave, so to speak. And Democrats were doing that in the 60s because so many liberals at the bottom, white and black, cared more about talking about civil rights and voting rights than they did about expanding unions.
Yeah, he lists a number of policy ideas that, in his view, are just a starting point, whereas people who oppose these ideas say they go way too far right from the get-go. So he says taxing away piled up wealth, personal and corporate, is one way to ameliorate economic inequality. Price and rent controls are another. Capping the income of business executives or eliminating government subsidies and corporate tax exemptions can also be part of an egalitarian agenda. Minimum wage legislation, shoring up the right to join a union, can work to reduce maldistribution of income. He goes on here with a number of proposals. We're not even doing those, really.
Well, I'm all for those, and progressive Democrats in general are, for most of them at least. But again, you need the votes.
And why doesn't Biden have 75 Democratic senators?
You need the votes. And if all Democrats in Congress vote exactly the way that AOC and Bernie Sanders vote, you still wouldn't get these things through, because you still need 60 votes at least in the Senate.
Yeah, and I should say that the people at Catalyst want to dismantle capitalism, too. Most Democrats...
And that's, it's a socialist publication. It's published by Jacobin, which is a popular socialist publication. Just as on the right, people should put out ideas that are not going to be passed anytime soon, it's important to have a vision as well as to think pragmatically. I think those two things in politics are both essential, but you shouldn't mistake one for the other. You should never think that, well, your vision is so wonderful. Why are the Democrats supporting these things? Why are they supporting these things? They're not supporting these things because right now they're very far from being able to win them. When you go to the voters, you have to talk about things you did pass. You can't talk about things you tried to pass and didn't pass. You could do that, but it's not going to convince anybody to vote for you.
When it comes to unions, then, what did you think of Bernie Sanders' exchange with the Starbucks CEO in Congress?
Do you understand that in America, workers have a fundamental right to join a union and collectively bargain to improve wages, benefits, and working conditions? Do you understand that?
I understand, and we respect the right of every partner who wears a green apron, whether they choose to join a union or not.
Are you aware that NLRB judges have ruled that Starbucks violated federal labor law over 100 times during the past 18 months, far more than any other corporation in America?
Sir, Starbucks Coffee Company unequivocally, and let me set the tone for this very early on, has not broken the law.
Well, I think it's great. As you know, I'm a social democrat. I'm a big supporter of unions. I think they're essential, not just for Democrats winning, but also for people to have democracy at the workplace. That's what unions mean. They mean you have a say about your work. In basic terms, you can't be fired at will. You have a right to complain about your boss without being fired. It's democracy, I think, at the workplace, where most people spend a majority of their waking hours. So that's why I'm for unions in a moral way, not just because they help Democrats, which I'm also for as a Democrat.
Bernie Sanders accused the Starbucks CEO of breaking the law, and it reminded me to ask you this question. Is the NLRB dead?
Well, it's not dead because it's still the only agency that we have that will enforce labor laws, that will make it possible for a union election to be held if a majority of workers in a given bargaining unit want to hold that election. It's the only one that can fine employers for unfair labor practices, which is the term from the act that was passed in 1935 that is used. So it certainly should be stronger, in my opinion. It should be make it much harder for employers to bully workers, to keep them for long hours at meetings, to convince them not to vote for the union, fines, much heavier fines on employers than there are now for engaging in what are called unfair labor practices, firing workers trying to organize a union, for example, which is expressly prohibited by the Wagner Act. It's much harder to organize a union than it should be. If a majority of workers in a given workplace want to have a union, they should be able to have a union. That's democracy. But right now, even that is very hard to do. It's called card check. If 50% plus one of workers in a given bargaining unit sign cards saying they want to have a union, they should be able to have a union. But now that's just the beginning of the process. Then they have to go to the NLRB, the labor board, and get the election held. In that meantime, it could be months in between. Then employers have all the right in the world to try to convince workers not to join the union. And then, as with Starbucks now, it can take months, even years, to negotiate an actual contract. That's happening with Amazon, too, with that one warehouse in Staten Island where the union did win the election. So the labor law should be changed, but it's not defunct because it's still the only law we have.
My last question to you, you started to ask it for me. I was going to bring up the Amazon Labor Union, ALU, a warehouse in Staten Island, New York. That was a year ago when those workers there decided to organize and voted to do so, but they still don't have a collective bargaining agreement. Just goes to show you how difficult this is. There's no going back to the so-called golden age, right? All those industries, right, that were the basis for unionization, many of them are diminished or gone. That's why it's called deindustrialization. So,
right. Yeah, we used to have a big textile industry in this country, remember?
That's right.
Hardly any textiles or even clothing, for that matter, at least low-end clothing.
Yeah. So what's going to be the basis of the new union movement that these young workers at Starbucks and Amazon are trying to organize around? It would appear that it's the service industry.
Oh, yeah, because that's where a majority of Americans actually work, It's going to be education. It's going to be healthcare. It's going to be retail. Yeah. IT as well. That's where a majority of people work today. And if you can't organize Google, if you can't organize Starbucks, if you can't organize Walmart and Amazon, you're not going to have a strong union movement.
Michael Kazin, and again, the book is What It Took to Win, A History of the Democratic Party. On the next episode of History as It Happens, the Trump indictment. It's been said that Gerald Ford's pardon of Richard Nixon prevented the United States from having any precedent on how to prosecute a former leader. We'll explore that notion with Michael Dobbs next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.